Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. As you know, I worked overseas for about 4 years. Well, you know if you've been watching my show, which is on only every other Wednesday at 7:30. And the first show I did, I talked about living overseas, living in a military community, even though I'm a civilian, and just what a great job they do over there and a great job our military does, and how proud I was of the military and still am, and proud of what they were doing over there in Iraq. I personally support the effort, but I don't support the way it's been handled at the top level. I think the soldiers, the Marines, I think they're doing a wonderful job, even some of the contractors. But at the very, very top, there's been one mishandling after another. Nobody wants to take responsibility for the errors and mistakes. And as a matter of fact, in my opinion, a lot of good men and women have been killed when they didn't need to, if they had had the right equipment at the right time when they needed it. Part of the problem has to do with the approach when they first went in. And of course, the leaders of the effort, whether we want to admit it or not, throughout the whole thing were the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Mr. Paul Wolfowitz. Donald Rumsfeld is still Secretary of Defense. Mr. Wolfowitz is now head of the World Bank. He has been pushed out of that position. There were a lot of things that happened. I won't go into that because I did about 4 weeks ago, but I was very surprised on Monday, April 25th, when I bought the New York Times, and there on the front page of the New York Times is an article, very large article, Bloody Marines Sound Off About Want of Armor and Men. Now, I talked about 4 weeks ago that at the beginning of the war, we had very, very heavy armor. We had Bradleys, we had Abrams tanks, and we had a thrust of armor that came in from Kuwait and came north through Basra and then through the center of the country and then up to Baghdad. And then Baghdad was encircled from the west near the airport and from the south and east by the Marines. Beautiful pincer movement. And then all of a sudden, the enemy disappeared. The Republican Guard disappeared and melted into the populace. And the statue of Saddam was pulled down. And a couple weeks later, the president landed on an aircraft carrier with the message, mission accomplished, a message that he had been given by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. Was the mission accomplished? Well, very, very clearly. We're still at war. It's 2 years later. A year and a half after the battle, the initial battle, while these insurgencies were still going on. Basically, let's face it, an insurgency is just a nice word for a guerrilla war. There is no front, there is no rear, and one of the big problems that has occurred is that the patrols were conducted in Humvees, and the Humvees were not armored, and consequently, many, many Marines, many, many soldiers, many of the support people were killed. In fact, even worse, or not worse than that, but at least as bad, is the transporters were also driving in unreinforced and unarmored vehicles. They have these giant military trucks called HETs, and they weren't armored up either. And one of the tactics of the insurgents has been to try to cut and destroy our supply lines by blowing up these transports, and there's been a problem ever since. Around the end of this last year, 2004, Mr. Rumsfeld went out to Kuwait and did a town hall meeting with a large group of National Guardsmen, I believe. They might have been reservists. And one of these soldiers got up and, as can happen in a town hall meeting, asked an unscripted question. That question was, why do we have to scrounge through junkyards and put armor onto our Humvees and onto our vehicles in order to protect ourselves. Why didn't we get armored Humvees and armored trucks? The fact of the matter is that right now the trucks are in the process of being armored and the Humvees are in the process of being armored. But what was the problem? The problem was at the beginning of the war, Mr. Rumsfeld and the senior leadership had no idea, as they said, that there would be an insurgency. They thought there'd be a few dead-enders would keep on fighting, but they did not believe that they would be in a guerrilla war situation. And they were wrong. And nobody has taken responsibility for that mistake. What did that mistake do? After the initial attack, and 2 weeks after Baghdad, but before the borders had been under control, about 133,000 troops had entered. What they did, which was a new and actually a brilliant strategy, we have to give Tommy Frank some credit for this, and General Myers, they attacked before all of the troops had been bivouacked or gathered in Kuwait. And as troops were being brought into the field, they were sent into battle division by division. And by the end of the war, or by the end of the first phase of the war, there were about 133,000 troops. A decision was made by Donald Rumsfeld. It was made by Donald Rumsfeld personally to stop the any more troops from coming in when 133,000 had been met. There had been an armored division that had been landed and that was about to enter the fray and about to enter, and who may have, if things had gone the right way, had sealed the border from the terrorists that were coming in, or at least had tried to secure some of these bases, Saddam's bases, that were filled with munitions that were being emptied by trucks and cranes, as came out a year later, by the Baathists in order to prepare for the guerrilla war. Nothing was done. And in fact, Rumsfeld personally ordered that the troops would not be allowed in, and that the last division would be turned around, and that no more troops would go to Iraq except during 6-month rotations. What was the result of this? The result of this was that we were not ready for the insurgency when it occurred. We did not secure those bases. We did not secure the border so that Al-Qaeda and foreign terrorists and suicide bombers were able to infiltrate. We didn't really have a clue. And who didn't have a clue? Did the soldiers not have a clue? Did the Marines not have a clue? No. Rumsfeld didn't have a clue. And he has never taken responsibility for messing that up. And as a matter of fact, a year later, at the end of 2004, he was still saying we have to fight with the army that we have, not the army that we want to have. But in fact, he had pulled out the armor that was there, and he had sent the troops to patrol in Humvees. This was all denied because it was later said, after this whole thing came up with what about the armored Humvees, that the unarmored Humvees were just to be put into the rear, but we didn't realize how big the rear was. And as a matter of fact, what these Marines say, because they were stationed around Ramadi, is that they were given, and this is April of 2004, so this is a whole year after the invasion, they were given unarmored Humvees. Is this a good thing? Obviously not. Right now, what I have here is a picture, basically from this article, taken by the captain who was in charge of Company E of the Marines, or a Marine division. And this is a Humvee that was used by these Marines around Ramadi in April of 2004. Why is April of 2004, May 2004 so important? That was the first big battle around Fallujah. That was the battle in which the Marines had gotten all the way to pretty much surrounding Zarqawi and were pulled back by the senior leadership and by the Secretary of Defense. and stopped from capturing the head of the insurgency. Why? Nobody knows. After that, Fallujah became the center and became a no-go zone where Americans were not even allowed to fight the insurgents, and the insurgents took over pretty much a whole province, and part of that province was Ramadi, where these particular Marines were headquartered. This is an unreinforced Humvee. You can see some armor on the sides. Those were put together by a Staff Sergeant, Jose Valerio, who very nobly tried to armor it himself with scrap metal. The scrap metal only came up to the shoulders, and 4 Marines in that particular vehicle were killed with wounds to the head due to a IED, which is an improvised explosive device, and because this armor was not high enough in order to protect the heads of these particular Marines. Okay, let's see if we can get back to, very good. Okay, May 29, 2004, station wagon that Iraqi insurgencies had packed with C4 explosives, I'm reading from the article, on a highway in Ramadi killed 4 Marines who died for a lack of a few inches of steel. 4 returning to camp in an unarmored Humvee that their unit had rigged with scrap metal, but the makeshift shields rose only as high as their shoulders. Photographs of the Humvee show, and this is the Humvee, that the shrapnel from the bomb had shot over the top. Steel was not high enough, said Staff Sergeant Jose Valerio, their motor transport chief. The men would have lived, and their vehicle, had their vehicle been properly armed. Most of the shrapnel wounds went to their heads. Among those killed were Rafael Reynoso, 28-year-old Lance Corporal, whose wife was expecting twins, and Cody Calavan, 19-year-old Private First Class, among others. They were not the only losses from this company. They lost more than 1/3 of their troops during their tour in Iraq. So out of 185 troops, we don't have the exact number, it wasn't given in the article, but that is about 60 Marines that were killed. In returning home, the leaders and the Marine infantrymen have chose to break an institutional code of silence and tell their story. When they say it was punctuated by not only by a lack of armor, but by a shortage of men and planning that further hampered their efforts. Saga of Company E, part of the Lionized Battalion, nicknamed Magnificent Bastards, is also one of fortitude and integrity and ingenuity. They were asked to rid the provincial capital, this is even today one of the most dangerous places in Iraq, of one of the most persistent insurgencies, and endured 26 firefights, 90 mortar attacks, and more than 90 homemade IED bombs. By the time they shipped their dead home and powered on. The experiences of Company E Marines pieced together through interviews at Camp Pendleton, by phone, company records, and dozens of photographs taken by the Marines show that they did just that. Now, we can only be proud of these people. They fought nobly, they lost a lot of their own men, they were in the worst of the insurgency, but I have to admit, this one is an insurgency that our senior leadership did not even expect, even after it was going on for months. During the initial attack, there were articles, and I read them in the paper myself, and of course, I don't know anything, as you can tell by listening to me, that Saddam Hussein was planning a guerrilla war, and that he had emptied out the banks of money in order to finance it, and that already during the initial insurgency, the attacks with, guerrilla attacks with IEDs had already begun. So how could you not expect this to continue when the intelligence already said it had started during the initial attack? Why didn't it kill that many during the initial attack? Because they were in extremely highly armored vehicles. These were the vehicles that were taken away by our senior leadership because they thought, oh, there was never going to be any guerrilla war. There was going to be a front, and a rear, and once we clean up Saddam and his diehards, then we are going to rebuild Iraq with Iraqi money from the oil. Needless to say, that didn't quite work out that way. I do support the elections that were there. I support the government that is there. I think it's great that the Iraqis have had an election. I don't think it's a great idea or it reflects well that we ended up with an insurgency that could have been stopped. Why do I say that? Well, right after the initial invasion, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Services, General Shinseki, and the Secretary of the Army were both relieved of their command and forced into retirement. At the time, no explanation was given. Later, it turns out that Shinseki had recommended and had actually put a plan forward, which was rejected by the Secretary of Defense, to go in there with a minimum of 240,000 and more likely 360,000 troops. And of course, that would have taken time to organize that force, so the attack would have been many, many months later than it actually occurred. Why were they rejected? Why were these Shinseki and Alexander fired? To this day, there is no explanation why General Shinseki was relieved of his command and forced into retirement, especially since he ended up being right. We needed 240 to 360,000 troops. If we had those troops, we could have secured those bases. And there were reports within the last 4 or 5 months that trucks with cranes had pulled up to bases that were known to contain Saddam Hussein's and the Ba'athist Army's munitions, which are the IEDs today, the shells, the mines, the tank rounds, the artillery shells, which are all being used now and were emptied out basically during that first couple weeks when there was supposedly riots and chaos, which were brought under control a couple of weeks later. Apparently, not all of the riots and chaos were riots and chaos. A lot of it was planned. It was planned by our enemy, and our people, if they had had enough troops, would have been, as they went on, which is normal warfare and rules of war, all of which were broken, would have secured the rear as they came in to Baghdad. But in fact, there were no troops to secure the rear. There were no troops. The only rear that was secured at all were the oil fields in and around Basra and in the south because they didn't think there'd be a problem. And of course, there was. And the insurgency didn't end when Saddam was captured, mainly because the insurgency was taken over by Al-Qaeda and by Mr. Zarqawi and his group, which is called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, for the very simple reason that it is Al-Qaeda. He swore allegiance to bin Laden, and now he's the one who's leading the fight. What happened to him? He was in Fallujah in April of 2004. He was surrounded by Marines, as far as anybody knows, and the Marines were pulled back, and he was allowed to set up a no-fly, no-go zone and a base in that area. That base was destroyed in November of 2004, and it was destroyed by 13,000 troops, followed by the same armor that Rumsfeld did not want to leave in Iraq, by Bradleys and by Abrams tanks. And every time somebody shot at them, one of the terrorists, their building was blown to bits by a tank round. The first Battle of Fallujah, they didn't even have these very heavy armaments. Basically, the insurgents had attacked a convoy and had killed and hung at the bridge 4 contractors, and that's what started a confrontation with the Marines, and the Marines started pouring in, and they almost took out Zarqawi a whole year ago. As a matter of fact, there was a story, and I'm proud of the Americans that almost captured him. He was almost captured a week ago. Apparently, what he does is he has a car that travels a half a mile in front of him, then he travels a half a mile behind with his computer and everything he needs to communicate in his internet-enabled laptop. And the Americans knew where he was, or at least had an idea where he was. They set up a checkpoint to try to get him, and they had UAVs, which are unmanned aerial vehicles, or unmanned aerial airplanes overhead. And however, when that first car had been stopped, and there was I believe they captured the two people in it, another vehicle had turned around. That was the vehicle that Zarqawi was in. And that Zarqawi, who seems to know what he's doing, ended up coming into an underpass where the UAVs and the aerial vehicles couldn't see him, and he jumped out, and he got away. But they did get his laptop with a whole bunch of jump drives in it, and in those jump drives were names, some of the people, some of the plans, and so on and so forth. Treasure trove of intelligence, and hopefully they'll be able to clean up some areas. However, it hasn't seemed to have stopped the insurgency or slowed it down, because there's been a number of car bombings and suicide bombs in the last couple of weeks. So back to the story. Biggest danger to the men was traveling to and from camp. 18 of the 21 men who were killed had been riding in Humvees that failed to deflect bullets or bombs. So that's 18 people lost because of the unreinforced Humvees, or because they were reinforced as best they could in the field, not with real factory-made reinforcement kits, but with whatever people could find. Okay, there's a couple other interesting things about this. I got about 3 minutes left. Marine Corps officials disclosed last month in congressional hearings they were now going their own way. They've undertaken a crash program to equip all of their more than 2,800 Humvees in Iraq with stronger armor. The effort went into production, listen to this, November of 2004. We went into Iraq in March of 2003. So that's over 18 months later. And now we're saying we're going to do it. I'm glad they're going to do it. I'm absolutely overjoyed that they're going to do it. Now, a little bit of background on the reinforced Humvees. Why weren't the Humvees reinforced? If they intended to send the soldiers out into the neighborhoods, especially in the Sunni Triangle, where the Baathists, they knew the Baathists were strong, why did they send them in unreinforced Humvees? Well, the fact of the matter was that Rumsfeld, before the beginning of the Iraq War, the present Iraq War, had researched the Humvees. And armored Humvees had come out before the first Gulf War, and they had been discontinued during the Clinton administration. They started back up the factory armored Humvee program, but the total that they expected to produce were 15 per week. The factory has the capability of producing 550 per week. By August, which of course is 4 to 5 months into the insurgency, they realized that there was an insurgency. And then they came forward and they said, well, we would like to increase this production run. And they found out that in order to increase the production run, they would have to take a year. There would have to be a year gap. A year that could have been the year 2003, have these things ready and coming into play in 2004. Or the year 2002 to come in 2003. As a matter of fact, it did take a year, and most of the Humvees had not been reinforced even by the time the soldier had talked about it in December of 2004. So even then, they found out that only 450 a month or a week or a month had been produced, not 550. Okay, the name of the show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. My name's Reed Silverne. I will be on a week from next Wednesday.